I'm choosing to begin Unit 1, Ancient Civilizations, with Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia ends up forming the basis of Middle Eastern culture, which heavily influences Europe later. Even though there's not a lot of shows that are set in this time period, this style is still borrowed throughout fashion and seen in ways that a designer should be able to identify where those inspirations are being pulled from. So I'm going to begin this lecture talking a little bit about the contemporaneous neighbor of Mesopotamia, which was Egypt. The next lesson will deal with Egypt, but the two cultures grow up at the same time, but have very, very different bases, which I am looking forward to discussing with you all. In Egypt, agriculture flourished because of the annual flooding of the Nile. This created a rich deposit of soil, which made fertilizers unnecessary. There was also geographical unity in Egypt. The Nile flows from south to north, but for the most part, it's a very gentle valley region that didn't have really any hillsides or whatnot. It was a warm climate which was uniform throughout the year, and it had the benefit because of this of continual planting. So there weren't really a lot of seasons to contend with. There would be the annual flooding of the Nile and certain things that would happen on a regular basis, but nothing that would keep farmers from continuing to farm. It was also surrounded by natural barriers, which made it isolated by deserts and the sea, which really created a stable political and religious continuity because there were very few foreign invaders. So for about 3,000 years, there were very gradual changes in the culture of Egypt. There was limited trade. They certainly still did trade, and they were very aware of the Mesopotamians. And as you will see later, they were very influenced by certain parts of the Mesopotamians. Spoiler alert, the pyramids were basically built off of some architecture that the Mesopotamians were creating. So for the most part, there was really stable political structures in Egypt until the 10th century BCE. Then there was a series of invaders, the Libyan pharaohs, the Nubian pharaohs. In 1670 BCE, there were the Assyrians. Then they had some independence, and then the Persians came in, and the Greeks came in 332, and then finally Rome. But really, for 3,000 years, Egypt was extremely stable. In Mesopotamia, the word Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers. The region differed much more than Egypt. You had seasons, there was differences in altitude, differences in climates, so there are mountains and plains and deserts. This resulted in a variety of needs for clothing. So whereas in Egypt, people were able to wear very little and it was very temperate, herders who would move up to the mountains would need much thicker clothing than someone in more of a desert region. Agriculture was very different. So whereas for the most part crops were very easy to grow in Egypt and were a little less varied, in Mesopotamia each area supported different crops. So each crop needed special skills and care. Each crop required a specific kind of labor force to grow it, different investment capital, different organization of architecture. So for instance, flocks needed to be moved seasonally, flocks of usually sheep, which were very popular in Mesopotamia. Different kinds of grain crops required long-term storage and distribution throughout the year. And also some plants required long-term planting and planning, while others would be sown and harvested in a short time. Because they weren't as geographically isolated, there was a lot more trade with neighbors. And this also made Mesopotamia much more open to invaders. And there was lots more contact with other cultures. So we really see a lot of political instability, but through all of this, we see a lot of similar styles that build upon each other. So in looking at a timeline here, there's the early Sumerian from 3500 to 2500 BCE, the late Sumerian and Babylonian from 2500 BCE to 1000 BCE-ish, the Assyrians from 1000 to 600 BCE, the Neo-Babylonians, they come back between 620 and 539 BCE, and the Persian Achaemenid Empire from 550 to 330 BCE. This is just sort of information I want you to have in your mind as we talk about the different styles. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the early Sumerians. So this was the first culture to emerge in the Bronze Age. The Sumerians founded the first cities, and you can see here in the sort of purple region where many of them are. They were a loose confederation of city-states, so think a little bit Greece as we move forward and talk about the Greeks. But essentially, there was enough prosperity to start creating an urban center, and therefore tribes and civilizations were built up around those urban centers, and they became larger and larger over time, but they really existed within the borders of a fairly small area. So out of this, we get the Great Ziggurat at Ur. So this is what the city-state of Ur looks like. You can see over here, here's what the ziggurat would have sort of looked like in comparison to the rest of the city. You can see that these buildings sort of grew up in a hodgepodge of different sort of constructions. There's different city walls. I encourage you to really blow this picture up because some of the information in here is quite useful. The Great Ziggurat of Ur itself, this is a sort of recreation of it, a sort of digital 3D project that someone did. It was actually rebuilt by Saddam Hussein. Not the whole thing, but it was largely rebuilt as sort of a hearkening back to the past. And so there has been excavation at the site and all of that, so that's where the information comes from. We know this existed, and we're fairly certain it looked like this. Unlike, say, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which some people don't even know if they really existed or if they were just rumor. We assume they probably did, but they may have existed somewhere other than where we think in Babylon, because the records from the time are a little spotty. But we know this structure existed. What's great about ziggurats, they're called step pyramids, is they were a method to make humans be closer to the gods. And this was particularly important because of the fact that the region was much less temperate and prone to flooding and prone to all kinds of different nature. So people really felt that they needed to appease the gods in order to continue to prosper. So these buildings were built with that in mind as part of the political and religious structure. Stone was very difficult to obtain in this region, unlike in Egypt. And so they would make bricks from mud and clay. Clay is the more stable of the brick construction. There was a lot of that in the riverbeds. Especially this being the land between two rivers, meaning what Mesopotamia is named after, the word that Mesopotamia means, they had lots of access to clay. This very, very top portion here, where many of the religious rites were participated in, was called the Egal, E-G-A-L. And this is not the only example of this kind of step pyramid. There's also step pyramids in Mayan temples in the Americas. There's other kinds of step pyramids in the Indus River civilization. But because this class already covers so much history in a very short period of time, I'm not going to get deeply into that information. Just know that there were other civilizations at this time in other parts of the world, China, for example, that were also developing, so this is not happening in a vacuum all by itself. And these structures are very, very impressive, but it is kind of amazing to think that humans built this structure, clearly a wider step, laid on another step, laid on another step, laid on another step, and so on and so forth in different cultures as a way to get closer to the sky. This was it from a trip when I went to Mexico, and I actually got to see Chichen Itza, which is this area here. It's just really flabbergasting to see things this old, and I encourage you to go away and see these items for yourself. The other thing about ziggurats is they really fire our mind. And so here is Blade Runner. This is the Tyrell building from Blade Runner. I was very tempted to show you parts of it. But they were really pulling from that sort of ancient source of power in order to create sort of this vision of the future that we see in Blade Runner. Here's another picture of it, sort of the modern cityscape, well, the more advanced than we are currently cityscape, against this huge building complex. And it really sort of gives you a sense of what people living so long ago must have felt when they saw this structure. And this is the interior of the Tyrell building in Blade Runner. And you can just sort of feel the ancient inspiration just by looking at these columns and the sort of brick interior, the sort of stately heaviness of the style, of the influence that they were looking back to in the Mesopotamian culture. And so now what I would like you all to do is to exit this video in whatever way you are watching it, and to follow the lesson plan. So there's 2 videos after this one. They're both Edpuzzle videos to ask you questions and or to track your progress. And so the first one is this Cradles of Civilization lessons of Dr. David Nieman, who is in many ways a old school professor. I hope you enjoy him as much as I do. I know he seems to talk slowly. Just bear with him. He's brilliant. And then also another Edpuzzle 2, which is Crash Course World History number 3, Mesopotamia. So you're going to see a lot of Crash Course World History as we move forward, just because we are covering so much time, and I'm really amused by this nerd. Okay, I will see you in part 2 after you've watched both of those videos.